This time, we're amongst the rolling hills of Dorset, an idyllic natural landscape. Or so it seems. Because take a second look and you realise this place isn't quite as natural as it first appears. Basically, this feels like a massive outdoor sculpture park. And in fact, all of these wonderful curves and dips and banks are man-made. They're the ghosts of ferocious defences built well over 2,000 years ago by the tribes who used to live here long before the Romans invaded. This is Maiden Castle, near the Roman town of Dorchester. An entire hill carved by Iron Age people into a huge fortification known as a Hillfort. There are 2,000 hill forts in the country, and this is the largest, not just in Britain, but in the whole of Europe. Tradition has it the invading Roman army seized this place in a bloody battle. But that feat seems almost impossible to imagine as you walk around its still awe-inspiring defences. So how on earth did the Romans conquer this astonishing super fortress? To begin to answer that question, we first need to picture Maiden Castle in its prime. And that means ignoring its rather misleading name. It's funny, isn't it? Because when you say the name castle, you kind of automatically picture a place with turrets and arches and
the
gateways.
drawbridge and all that kind of medieval stuff.
Yeah.
And of course, this is not a medieval castle. This is an Iron Age, a prehistoric fortification. They were building in earth and timber.
And also it was white, made out of chalk, and you're living in a kind of green world then. So it's making a real statement in the landscape.
Absolutely. It wouldn't have been this gentle folding into the hillside that we see today. No, this would have been stark white, right in your face. We're here right on top of this hill.
With this vast gleaming fortress, the native Britons proclaimed their power and permanence. But what happened when the most powerful army on earth, the Romans, turned up? To hunt for evidence, Ben's brought this, an octocopter. This drone gives us the reconnaissance shots the Romans never had. And allows Ben to pick out the details and shapes that just aren't visible from the ground.
So we're just coming up over the top of the ditches now, and they are massive, and not just one or two ditches that you can see from down here, but layers and layers of ditches and banks. And some of those, I think we're talking 10, 20 metres, 60 feet deep perhaps, some of those. And it looks impregnable, but look at this shape right here, this square, this stone foundation, completely different. This is the remains of a classic Roman temple, and it's a clear sign that the Romans took control of this place at some stage.
Maiden Castle would ultimately end up in Roman hands. But this place was created long before they turned up. But why? What first drove people to change a hill into a fortress? Well, it turns out this place was started after a prehistoric version of the banking crisis. It happened at the end of the Bronze Age, a relatively peaceful, stable time, until the bronze ran out.
Bronze is so important. Bronze is it's a whole currency, society is organised around the exchange of bronze.
Yeah.
What happens when the bronze disappears? What do they do?
And I guess if it, as you say, if it stops, that's like, you know, our currency. It's like money going.
Absolutely, it's like 2007. What would happen if the banks had gone bust? What would we have done for a currency?
Yeah.
It would have been a real problem.
With the economy in meltdown and tension in the air, local people must have feared for their safety and security. So they left their scattered farms on the lowlands and banded together to move to higher ground. Here they would create a hilltop stronghold, and Ben's eye in the sky shows the move was such a success, they had to build an extension.
I can clearly see a sort of crease, a curving depression running right across the middle of the hilltop. And this is the partially filled in ditch and bank, and it shows me where the original boundary of the Hillfort was. And you can see this place seems to have been about half the size originally. Over time, they enclosed the whole hilltop, more than doubling the Hillfort's area. This must be the work of, well, thousands of people, and probably over many generations. They tell us this place was organised and powerful for centuries.
Maiden Castle became an awesome symbol of power. But it was also a place where people lived. And when they weren't working on their extension, Maiden Castle's residents farmed the surrounding land, commuting back to the safety of the Hillfort each evening through 2 great gates. So this is the original entrance, and what, continued through to a road up here?
Yeah, we're sort of coming into the interior now. You can look around and there's a road leading off in front of us, and on that road there would be houses on one side, a row of houses perhaps, and storage facilities, big grain stores on the other side. So a really, quite a sophisticated and organised settlement.
Wow, and how many people up here?
We're up to 1,400, 1,500 people living in the interior.
I mean, that feels more like almost like the beginnings of a town.
Well, you could say it's a town. Certainly people did not live permanently in big settlements like this in previous years. So this is the first, if you want to call it a town, this is the first town in Britain. People are living together, densely packed together, and that's it's a really major decision.
This windswept hill had become one of the most impressive settlements in Britain. A place buzzing with life. Here archaeologists have unearthed jewellery, combs, even the skeleton of a pet dog carefully buried. This ancient mirror found nearby shows they had access to luxuries too.
Apart from the total delight of holding something that's 2,000 years old, it's just brilliant to be up close to this, because it really says a lot about life up in those hill forts. You get the sense from something like this that these were sophisticated, well-functioning little communities. And a lovely bit of frippery like this, it's a mirror, for goodness sake, tells me that these were men and women who weren't just full of fear, but full of hope.
Maiden Castle marked a high point of prehistoric British civilization. But it didn't last. This Roman temple on top tells us the Britons lost this territory. Evidence of just how that happened is harder to spot. But Ben has seen an intriguing clue by the eastern entrance.
Right over on the east, there's an area thick with a different kind of vegetation. Now that indicates to me that there's something different going on beneath the soil. And one thing that encourages this sort of growth is digging, turning over the soil.
And in fact, there has been digging here, back in the 1930s. It was led by this man, Sir Mortimer Wheeler, a soldier, broadcaster and pioneering archaeologist.
It is in the hope of finding out something more about the beginnings of modern England that we are now digging up the remains of this ancient city.
Wheeler's excavations on this spot at Maiden Castle led him to propose a dramatic theory. Mortimer Wheeler thought that Maiden Castle was the site of the last stand of the native Britons, the scene of a brutal massacre that extinguished an ancient way of living and heralded the advent of the shiny, smart, all-conquering Romans. And he came up with some pretty convincing and very gruesome evidence to back up his thesis. Wheeler unearthed the remains of over 50 ancient Britons near the eastern entrance. 2 skeletons in particular suggested this was the site of a ferocious battle against the Romans.
These are the skeletons of 2 men who lived in the 1st century AD, and they've been displayed exactly as they were found at Maiden Castle. They've both suffered horrific head wounds. Basically, their skulls have been smashed in by some kind of a blunt instrument, maybe a club or the pommel of a sword. But the real clincher is down there. It's a thing called a ballista bolt, and it's lodged into the spine of that man. Ballistas were horrible inventions. They were made by the Romans and they were basically mechanised crossbows. And a ballista bolt would have ripped into your body, splitting open bones and vital organs. It was a truly terrible way to die. When he discovered these, Mortimer Wheeler was convinced that he'd found a great battlefield cemetery, the result of a mammoth conflict between the Romans and the ancient Britons.
Wheeler thought the Romans barged their way in and massacred the locals. But as Ben is discovering, the challenge of getting into Maiden Castle in its prime would have been extraordinary. And he has a vantage point no Roman ever had.
There we go, you're starting to get pictures.
Oh, yes.
And obviously we've got this incredible luxury of trying to unpick it all from above. But if you were down there on the ground, faced with the choice, well, which way do I go? Yeah. I mean, there's nothing to indicate how to actually get into the Hillfort.
No, that's right. If you're down there at the bottom coming up the hill, it's incredibly difficult to know which way to turn. And we have to remember that originally it wasn't just earthworks. There would have been timber gateways blocking your entrance at every turn.
And it would have been much taller and deeper than it is now.
Yeah.
It's sort of slumped a little bit.
And it's not just physical defence, it's psychological as well, because it's disorientating. You just can't tell where you go next. The whole thing, it's a labyrinth, really.
Well, I certainly would not like to be storming this place, not having the benefit of the aerial view. I'd like to know what I was taking on.
Yeah, I think you'd think twice about it, frankly.
And any attackers would face more than just this complex maze. There was also deadly prehistoric ammunition to dodge. Ammunition that today is held in the storerooms of nearby Dorchester Museum.
This is Maiden Castle.
All this was Maiden Castle.
And there's 360 boxes in total.
Yeah.
Have a look at this box here. That contains sling stones.
Sling stones. But of course, you're right next to the sea, so you're going to be using pebbles as your slingshot. Yeah. How exactly were these used?
So you'd have a piece of cloth or something, and you wind it round his head very fast, and then let go, and this will shoot out, and bang, you're dead.
So it might look like a humble pebble to us, but this is a lethal weapon.
A lethal weapon.
How many of these were found originally?
Over 20,000.
That
is a lot.
That is a lot. That's a serious weapon store. Maiden Castle's defenders could have stood on its ramparts, hurling spears and firing their 20,000 lethal missiles at anyone caught in the confusing killing ground of the entrance. In its prime, this was a great dreadnought of a fortress, one of the most impressive in Europe, and armed to the teeth. I suppose, as you say, if you can imagine, in its heyday, you've got those banks absolutely lined with warriors, as, literally kind of rattling their spears.
Absolutely. I mean, if I was the Roman centurion tasked with taking this place, I'd be looking at it from a distance, quaking in my sandals, thinking, how on earth am I going to do this?
So just how did men like this end up killed by Roman weapons, with a Roman temple plonked on top of their terrifying super fortress? Maiden Castle, Dorset, once the greatest fortress in Britain and home to our very first town. Until the Roman army came along, slaughtering Britons and burying them where they fell. Or at least that was the theory of this man, archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler. But evidence from the air is starting to make Ben sceptical.
This is the war cemetery where Wheeler found dozens of bodies and concluded a battle must have taken place. But the location is interesting, just outside the eastern entrance. Now, it's not uncommon to find human remains and burials at the entrance of Iron Age sites. So it could be that the bodies found here were just part of a perfectly ordinary cemetery. Now, Mortimer Wheeler thought that the Roman army came storming up here, murdering and slaying on its way, and basically the people were buried where they dropped, where they were cut down.
Yeah.
But there's another explanation.
Well, I think it's just as likely that they were killed elsewhere and brought here for burial because the entrance to the Hillfort was felt to be an appropriate place to bury people who'd been killed in battle or by some other violent means.
More than 50 bodies were found here, but only 14 suffered a violent death. And just one was definitely killed by a Roman weapon. It's hardly proof of a great battle. But how else could the Romans take this fortress? Well, it might be that Maiden Castle wasn't quite in battle-ready condition when the Romans arrived.
So if we imagine the Romans have made their way across southern England, they've marched right up here and they're paraded out on those flatlands. But what would they have looked up to here?
Well, I think it might not have looked very different from what it looks today, because people have actually started moving out of the Hillfort by the times that the Romans appear.
In the centuries since Maiden Castle was built, it seems this whole area had become safer and more prosperous, and the locals less fearful of attack. Many decided they could do without commuting from a windswept hilltop each day and settled on the fertile but defenceless lowlands.
But so how many people would be left up there?
Well, I think probably was down to a couple of hundred, 300 maybe people. Wow. It was more of a settlement inside an old, decaying, ancient monument than an active Hillfort community.
So I suppose at this point, really, this isn't a ghost town, but it's really a shadow of its former self.
For many people, life had changed for the better. They didn't feel the need to maintain Maiden Castle as a strategic fortress, and when the Romans arrived, rather than fight, it seems a number of Britons welcomed their new Roman overlords.
Come on in.
Thank you. What a brilliant thing.
It's lovely, isn't it?
This is the remains of a Roman townhouse in Dorchester, close to Maiden Castle. Evidence of the kind of lifestyle Britons could have if they fell into line.
It's quite a compact but luxurious Roman townhouse.
Yeah.
And we've got a series of very nicely preserved mosaic floors. There's a fantastic little geometric mosaic here. There's a dining room behind us and corridors and more sort of private space moving off down the house. It's fantastic. It shows you, I suppose, what you can get if you've got the money and you've got the will. If you want to play Rome's game, this is the kind of house that you could inhabit.
Rome didn't just fight the native Britons, it seduced them.
So what it wants to try and do is to get the natives on board. So it's not all stick, there's quite a lot of carrot as well. If you can try and persuade them to be Roman and to be with you and to be part of the Roman system, then you can move your troops somewhere else.
So have a look at our lovely villas and our shiny tableware. Wouldn't you like to be a part of this?
Yeah, exactly. Trying to persuade them that they want to be part of the system with you.
The approach largely worked, though of course there were dissenters, like the man at Maiden Castle, shot by a Roman ballista bolt.
There is some evidence of violent death at Maiden Castle. We may be dealing with individuals who were executed by the Roman state for resisting against Rome, but it's not a big pitched battle.
So more a few scraps rather than Armageddon.
Absolutely.
After the Roman invasion, Maiden Castle continued to decline, and nearby Dorchester became Rome's regional capital. But the great Hillfort, looming over this new Dorchester, couldn't be forgotten. And that's where the Roman temple Ben was looking at earlier from the sky comes into play.
It's fascinating because Rome couldn't utterly eradicate a site like this from the landscape. It had to acknowledge it was here. So the next best thing is that you put your mark on it, you put your footprint on it.
Absolutely. And the temple, of course, itself is very visible because this would have been a tall tower-like structure bang in front of you as you look out from Dorchester.
This Roman temple was the last significant building to be situated on this hilltop, and Maiden Castle has been used as farmland ever since. That final mark of Roman power might suggest this is a story of all-conquering Romans.
But we must never be blinded by all that might and magnificence to the ingenuity and courage of the native population here. Men and women who, through their sheer ingenuity and nous, back in prehistory, created a life for themselves up here close to the clouds.
Because before the Romans pitched up, this settlement inside a super fortress was Britain's first town in the sky, and in its prime was never conquered.